It is truly wonderful to be here. As Marion said, when I left Kentucky for 4.5 years living and working in Switzerland, one of my last meetings was with the Kentucky Council of Churches. And one of the very first things I did in Kentucky when I moved here in 1984 was to attend the annual assembly in a state park where we had an intensive examination of Eucharist out of the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document that was new at that point. So it has always been a part of my life in this state to be a part of and to be an admirer of the work of the Kentucky Council of Churches, and I'm delighted to be here this morning. I have to say that as I return to this country and to our place, after being in another place for the longest I had been gone in my life, there were many things that were wonderful. It was wonderful to see old friends. It was wonderful to be with students and teaching again. But it grieved me very deeply and puzzled me that something had happened to our civic discourse while I was gone. Some ability, never perfect, but certainly better, that we had had to talk about real things with one another in public spaces, had eroded. Now, we all talk about that. I don't know anyone who laments it. I think we had wonderful perspectives on it yesterday. But I was very pleased that the assembly theme, and thus the commitment of this body with its unique role in the state, is to worry about our civil dialogue, to worry about our common space, to worry about our ability to talk with one another about how we construct lives that promote the flourishing of all. That has to be something that we care about, but not only in the privacy of our own homes when we complain. It has to be part of our common discourse to think about how we can approach a repair and a restoration together. So thank you for asking me to come. I share with some of the preachers last night the feeling that I am being asked to follow a hard act. Renee Shaw did a wonderful job yesterday. But Marion asked me to come and to be a historian among you first, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to direct our attention back to our Christian heritage. She didn't give me a text, but if I chose a text for myself, it would be Matthew 13:52. And I'm going to ask us to be like those scribes, those scholars that prepare for the reign of heaven by bringing out of their treasure what is new and what is old. Now we're going to find out that when we go into the Christian treasure house, we're going to find a lot, not only the new and the old, but also the lovely and the corrupted, the repentable and the celebratable. But it is our treasure house. And at the end, I'm going to suggest some ways that we as Christians have something to contribute to enrich the understandings of what it is to live in a pluralist society. Now let me say a little bit about what I'm not going to do. Quite a bit. I'm going to focus on those parts of the Christian tradition that most directly have shaped almost all of us in this room and almost all of our communities in Kentucky. So even though we're increasingly aware and we're proud at our seminary that we're showing this in our teaching, we're aware that there have been Christian communities in places most of us didn't know much about from the very beginning. I'm going to focus on the ones that come out of the Roman world into the European and North American worlds and shape us most directly. Also, I'm going to speak mostly about relations among Christians. But I don't want us to forget that Christians have never been out of important relationships with other religious communities. And these are always a decisive and formative factor in the way they think about how much diversity is possible and what you do with people who are espousing things that seem odd. That's true from the very beginning as Christians come into the pluralist world of the Roman Empire. It's true in their closest relationships in those years, their relationships with Jews who are in their own quest for discovering their identity in a changing world. It is not something that begins in our time, but it's something I'm going to deal with only elusively as we go forward. Okay, let's start. We know, we are often told, perhaps we worry in the middle of the nights, that Christianity has the reputation of being the most intolerant religion in the world, past or present of all the religious traditions. We are responsible, scholar after scholar says, for more violence, more intolerance, more exclusion in the human family than any other religious tradition. Seems that that's true. Now, part of this is related to the fact that we're such a big part of the Christian religious, or the world religious family. We're biggest now, we've been huge for a long time. By accidents of culture and geography, we've been in all kinds of places where opportunities to seek colonial domination, for example, came up. This is not entirely the fault of the Christian tradition, but we're not off the hook entirely for it either. And while I do not believe that there is something intrinsically wrong with Christian faith that inclines it to intolerance, I think we also have to look at the historical record and ask why we have found this always such a temptation. Why coercing others into faith has seemed like such a good idea so much of the time. Now, I'm going to ask us to pause for just a minute and look at our own personal histories and maybe the history of a couple of people near you, because my impression is that in a group like this, committed to civic dialogue, we are bearing in our Christian DNA a lot of the history of violence and religious coercion. Most of us, I'm guessing, will look back in our families and our families of faith to how we came to Christian identity, and it will not be apart from coercion and violence. For many of us who have European roots somehow, we're the roots of all kinds of conquests where somebody won a battle and a king became a Christian, and so did everybody else, whatever it took. We also, in our American context, have the huge defining experience of slavery that brings elements of coercion into the coming to faith of so many of our African American brothers and sisters. This does not mean, and here again, I'm asking us to look at our personal experience. In this room, we would claim our Christian faith with joy and gratitude. But that does not mean that it has come to us unbesmirched by these elements of coercion. So let's just take a minute, look back at what you know about your own tradition and maybe share with one other person at your table. Is it true that in your own life, the gifts of Christian faith and the liberation and the gracious possibilities that it offers in our lives have come to us through histories that are marked by these histories of making people Christian and the right kind of Christian, whatever it takes? So what we're going to do for the time we have together is to look back over 1,700 years. I chose that number for a specific reason that will become clear in a minute, making 3 major stops in the historical record. And then we'll come to 3 resources, 2 implications, 2 cheers, and maybe if we have time for it, a little quiz before we stop. So where are we going to go first? We're going to go to 313. This is the time when the Christian presence in the Roman world clearly came to a decisive turning point, and I picked that date partly because I suspect perhaps some of us didn't celebrate that 1700th anniversary this year, but there's still time. And if you look at this little picture down there, those people are celebrating this anniversary in Eastern Europe, where this became quite an important time to celebrate the moment when Christians were given religious freedom to be publicly present in the context where most of them lived at that time, the context of the Roman Empire. Now, it's not the case that they had been harshly and unreservedly and continuously persecuted for those first 300 years. Things had been very sporadic and uneven. I often say that the closest analog perhaps we have is the situation of Christians now in a country like Pakistan, where there are laws on the books that the government really isn't so interested in enforcing. But they can be enforced if there is a local dispute or an economic reason or a personal spasm of rejection that leads to the vulnerability that is always there being brought to judicial expression. Christians were in that kind of position. And in 313, that changed. The Edict of Milan, sometimes called the Edict of Toleration, gave to Christians and to members of other religious groups the right of open and free observance of their worship, I'm quoting now, for the sake of the peace of our times, so that each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases. This regulation is made that we may not seem to detract from the dignity of any religion. Now, I chose this place for us to start, not only because it's an easy to remember date for us this year, but because I wanted us to stop first when we look at the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Let's ask ourselves if that was quite as inevitable or one stop as we might have thought. The first step was this edict that allowed Christians as others, for the sake of the good of the whole republic, to openly and with dignity practice their religions as they saw fit. Now, why might you not have thought about that if you thought about the legacy of the emperor under whose rule that was promulgated? We know that Constantine, who was one of the emperors in 313, becomes the sole emperor because he's such a good politician, and then rules the Roman Empire till 337. We know that he stands at this turning point when the Roman Empire becomes somehow a Christian entity, a Christian state. But I'm going to say that that's not very clear at all when Constantine himself dies. This is not quite as decisive as we've often thought. And so maybe we've been fighting about some of the wrong things. Constantine is often seen as, on the one hand, a saint. In the Orthodox tradition, he is formally a saint, as is his mother. He is portrayed in much Western art as not only the winner of a crucial battle against somebody we always sort of forget about, but who won that battle under the guiding of God, under the vision that he was conquering militarily in the sign of the cross. And that has been celebrated as the great victory that led to the Christian Roman Empire. And it's also been seen as the decisive fall of the church from which we never recovered. The peace church traditions, not surprisingly, have taken this position with particular zeal. And they would stress that Constantine is this turning point for the worst. But I'm going to say that we can look a little bit differently at that legacy now. This is the same head you saw just a few minutes ago, which in its original context was at the top of a huge, colossal statue, literally bigger than life. You can see its size there relative to that person. But that's all that remains of it. So I think that in our time, we are able to look back at this legacy from a unique perspective. Those who were discussing, arguing whether this was St. Constantine in the beginning of the continued work of God to Christianize the Roman Empire, or the beginning of the fall of the church and this horrific disaster, were arguing within the framework where they still were operating within a world in which a Christian society somehow, if not legally established, still culturally dominant, was the kind of common sphere in which this discussion happened. This is not our context any longer. There are still remnants of it, but the kind, what we used to call Christendom, this Christian world, is in its very, very last days. So whatever began back there in the 4th century is something that we can look at from the other side now. And I think that allows us to have a different and a more nuanced perspective on how crucial a time that was. And I'll tell you what I'm going to say we can see. And that is that this was not a train that couldn't be stopped. This was not an inevitable kind of growth of the church's influence. It wasn't even the decision of one person. It wasn't even the accomplishment or the disaster of Constantine. If we want to look at the creation of a particularly close alliance between Christian faith and the power of the Roman Empire, a kind of alliance that sought to exclude, to penalize, and ultimately to eliminate other religious communities. We are not looking at the time of Constantine. He was not a towering figure in that regard. He may have gone around giving money to build churches and so on, which hadn't been legal until then. But he had not established Christianity as the legal faith, the faith that you adhered to or experienced great penalties. We would have to spend a whole lot more time than we have looking at the emperors who come after him, who zig and zag this way, try this, try that, do this, step back. By the end of the century, we're much closer to this kind of coercive alliance between the expectation of Christian faith and the enforcement by civil power. But I'm saying it took a lot of little decisions by a lot of different people over decades, decisions that could have been made in different ways to get us there. And that's an important thing for us to remember, I think. The second thing I want to say about the 4th century is that one of the reasons this seems to be such a train that can't be stopped is that some of the very best minds of Christendom were guiding that train. Some of the greatest theologians of the whole Christian experience were helping to guide that train. So with some pain, I'm going to talk about Augustine this morning. Now, all of you who have ever been my students, and there are bunches of us here, know how much I love and admire Augustine. I was talking about Augustine in the food line with Amariah last night. This is someone who plumbed the depths of the human spirit and the mysteries of God with a kind of intensity that transformed all of Christian discourse, the way in which we experience ourselves as persons, the way in which we think about God as triune and yet also utterly beyond our grasp. So many things would not have been available to us theologically without Augustine, including the formation of my own Lutheran tradition with its strong formation on grace, or the Reformed tradition, which is as indebted to Augustine, or the Catholic tradition, for whom this is a towering figure. And so I'm showing you my favorite picture of him. He doesn't look particularly like the African theologian that he is in this picture. But on the other side, compensating for that a little bit, is the dog that he has with him. And the dog is there to capture the sense that this is Augustine as he's writing his great work on the Trinity. And the presence of God, the irradiation of God's love, that illuminates the whole space is so strong that even the dog is caught up in this presence of God's love. This is Augustine at his best. It is incredibly costly for the Christian world that when he was at his worst, he was speaking about the place of coercion in civic life. And then he is absolutely chilling. He became a bishop in a small African town where there was a division among the Christians going back to the times of the persecution when the other party felt that they wanted to maintain a stronger purity and resistance to what they saw as giving in to some of the requests from the persecutors. It was a complicated theological issue. We can talk about that. But the point is, Augustine did not only talk about the theological questions, he talked about what happened when people didn't listen to his theological answers. He came to Hippo confident that he was going to preach the gospel truly and show the Donatists, that's this other party, show the Donatists where their error was, and they'd be convinced because he was right. And it didn't quite work that way. And so if you read his treatise on the correction of the Donatists, which is rather hard to find because it's not reprinted in a lot of the editions of Augustine's great works, in his very influential work on the correction of the Donatists, he begins to ask what other measures could be used to heal this great division between those who were right and those who were wrong in the Christian community. And he comes to I'm not going to underline the way in which this language resonates in our contemporary context. I'm sure you can hear it. He decides that just a little bit of persecution can be a good thing. First, it's good if people are compelled to come hear his wonderful sermons. How are they going to be convinced by them if they're not there? And so if they're just compelled to come. To quote Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he says, if we just compel them to come in, that wasn't so successful either. So he finds himself willing to use more and more little bits of persecution. How do we get their attention? Well, we could take their property. We could imprison them. What we really have to care about is, first of all, if they are convinced, they're glad of it. So it's for their own good. And even if we don't convince them themselves, we will convince their children. And that will justify the coercion that comes to the parents. Now, he stopped short of saying that anyone should be killed. But he was willing to use the harshest measures of imprisonment, confiscation, seizure of children in order to promote the truth. And in fact, he says, and this is where the chill index goes really a long way up, it's only persecution if people who believe the wrong things do it. Those who are furthering the truth, when they use some of these same measures, are not persecuting. And there it is. His confidence that he could argue the Donatists out by his superior, it was superior, rhetorical skill and learning and preaching ability, finally had to rest on their persecution. And that use of the truth to defend the use of violence that we were encouraged to think about yesterday also, perhaps not quite such gory violence. But if you do it in the name of truth, it excuses a lot. Well, it excused a lot. A striking example, a striking turning point. Do you see what I mean? That this isn't necessarily perhaps so inevitable with Constantine's time. It took a lot of other things. It took little decisions in out-of-the-way areas. It took multiple regimes, it took multiple Christian experiments. But by 100 years after the Edict of Milan, 313, we remember clearly, Augustine dies in 420. And in that century, things have changed. And the conviction that unity in faith is worth a whole lot of elimination of dialogue had become a much more defensible position. And the kind of armor of arguments that Augustine forged out of the scriptures and out of his experience are available for a long time. Okay, I'm now going to skip about 1,000 years. Just to say, when we get to the Reformation, things don't get a whole lot better. I've already said that both Luther and Calvin loved Augustine, and not only for that reason, but for others. These great reformers were willing also to use the civil state to eliminate diversity of opinion, to seek theological conformity in practice, but also in thought, in ways that become even more violent because now there is this diversity going on. So it's a time of enormous expansion of this kind of violence. Now the outliers are the Anabaptists, those who resist any kind of affiliation with the demands of the state because it demands things like the use of coercion, like the suppression of dissent, which are not Christian tasks to perform. And so they form their identity as those who resist this demand to conform, who resist the world's ways and create a pure Christian community. And they suffer horrendous persecution for it. Catholics, Reformed, Lutherans were equal opportunity executors of Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, on the other hand, tell the story. Here is one on the Martyr's Mirror, which is their collection that allies them with the martyrs of the early church. You can see there, we'll see this picture again in a little bit, but the story is that this Anabaptist dissident had been imprisoned and was facing execution. Somehow he escaped, and he was running away across the ice in Holland and fell through. Do any of you know this story? And if you were Anabaptists, you'd all know it because it's a story they teach to young people. But he was being pursued by one of his jailers, and the jailer fell through the ice. I think I may have had the wrong person falling through the ice a moment ago. The jailer falls through the ice, and Dirk Wilhelms, the Anabaptist, turns around to save the life of his persecutor, pulls him out of the cold water, is recaptured by this man, who then goes on to execute him. So it's a story of nonviolence, a witness to nonviolence, even at the cost of one's own life, that becomes a silent kind of counter-witness through the next centuries. But it's also important to say that even within the communities that were willing to use violence for the sake of religious conformity, it was possible to hold other opinions. And this is a very important point. If we look back at the past and say, they didn't think like us, that's a rather uninteresting statement. But if we say it was indeed possible to disagree in that time, it's not just a 21st century value we're trying to wish they held. If it was possible to hold this value in that time, then the kind of seriousness of the unconvincing character of that argument becomes even more serious. And there were people in Calvin's Geneva who said things like, when you executed Servetus, you did not defend a doctrine, you killed a man. There were people in the Lutheran community who said, God persuades. It is a violence against faith to execute someone whose faith is not the same as one's own. Luther was not persuaded, Calvin was not persuaded, but within their communities, these voices were raised. But the dominant strain was so much toward the seeking of religious conformity that the century after the Reformation is one of the most violent in Europe. There are religious wars in Britain, in France, in the middle part of the continent that are so severe that the 30 Years' War is a kind of metaphor for unproductive, senseless, ongoing war. Those of us who were old enough in this room to remember Bertolt Brecht as a playwright will remember Mutter Courage, his drama about someone caught up in this totally senseless destruction of so much of Europe in the name of religious war, in the name of seeking to promote the right faith against the wrong faith. Of course, all kinds of other political things were being fought for also. But these were, in important ways, religious wars. From 1618 to 1648 is the 30 Years' War. Now, just think about your American history for a minute. What was going on in the years of those first decades of the 17th century?